The rain had been falling for 3 hours straight when Detective James Thompson got the call. It was almost midnight on a Tuesday in October, and the streets of Pine Valley were slick with water that reflected the streetlights like broken mirrors. James had been a police officer for 15 years, and in all that time, he had learned to trust his instincts. Tonight, something felt different. "We have a domestic disturbance at 847 Maple Street." The dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio. Neighbors reported shouting and what might have been breaking glass. Units are responding. James knew Maple Street well. It was in one of the nicer parts of town, where the houses had big front yards and the driveways were lined with expensive cars. These weren't the kinds of calls he usually got, but domestic violence didn't care about zip codes or bank accounts. He'd seen enough to know that behind closed doors, pain looked the same everywhere. As he drove through the empty streets, James thought about his own family. His wife Rachel was probably asleep by now, and his 2 kids had school in the morning. His daughter Lisa was 16 and wanted to be a doctor. His son David was 14 and loved basketball more than anything else in the world. James worked nights so he could be there for their games and school events during the day. It wasn't easy, but family came first. The house on Maple Street looked peaceful from the outside. It was a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a well-kept garden. There were no broken windows, no signs of a struggle. But James had learned not to judge a situation by its surface. Some of the worst cases he'd worked had happened in houses that looked just like this one. He parked his patrol car and walked up the front steps. Before he could ring the doorbell, the front door opened. A woman in her 30s stood there wearing a bathrobe and holding a tissue. Her name was Jennifer Walsh, and she looked like she'd been crying. "Thank you for coming, officer," she said, quietly. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I didn't know what else to do." James introduced himself and asked what had happened. Jennifer explained that she and her husband had been arguing about money. Things had gotten heated, and he'd thrown a glass against the wall before storming out of the house. She was scared he might come back angry, and she just wanted someone to check on her. "Where did your husband go?" James asked, taking notes in his small notebook. "I don't know," Jennifer said. "Maybe to his brother's house, or maybe just driving around. He does that sometimes when he's upset. Takes the car and drives until he calms down." James spent about 20 minutes talking with Jennifer, making sure she felt safe and giving her information about local support services. It was the kind of call that happened more often than people realized. Not every domestic disturbance ended in arrests or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes people just needed someone to listen and help them feel secure. As he was finishing up his report, James heard another police car pull up outside. Through the window, he saw Officer Brad Sullivan getting out of his vehicle. James felt his stomach tighten a little. Sullivan had only been on the force for 3 years, but he'd already developed a reputation. There had been complaints, whispered conversations in the locker room, and more than a few times when other officers had to step in and calm down situations that Sullivan had made worse. James had never worked directly with Sullivan before, but he'd heard the stories. Last year, there had been an incident at a traffic stop that resulted in an official complaint. 6 months ago, Sullivan had been involved in an altercation at a convenience store that left everyone questioning his judgment. The department had given him counseling and additional training, but many officers wondered if that was enough. "Everything under control here?" Sullivan asked as he walked up to the front door. "Yes, just finishing up," James replied. "Mrs. Walsh had an argument with her husband. He left the house and she wanted us to check on her. Nothing more serious than that." Sullivan looked around the nice neighborhood, taking in the expensive cars and well-maintained lawns. "Fancy area," he said. "Don't get many calls here usually." James nodded and continued writing his report. He wanted to finish quickly and get back to his patrol route. Something about Sullivan's presence made him uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Jennifer Walsh thanked both officers and went back inside her house. James walked toward his patrol car, eager to move on to the next call. The rain had stopped, but the air was still thick with moisture, and fog was starting to form in the low-lying areas of the neighborhood. "Hey, Thompson," Sullivan called out as James reached his car. James turned around, and that's when he saw it. Sullivan had his hand on his weapon, and his body language had changed completely. His face was tense, his eyes were wide, and he was looking at James like he was seeing him for the first time. "Put your hands where I can see them," Sullivan said, his voice sharp and commanding. James was confused. "What are you talking about? It's me, Thompson, Detective Thompson." "I said, put your hands up." Sullivan's voice was louder now, and his hand was moving toward his gun. James realized what was happening, and a cold feeling spread through his chest. In the dim light from the street lamps, with the fog starting to roll in, Sullivan was looking at him and seeing something else. Someone else. Despite the fact that James was wearing his police uniform, despite the fact that he had his badge clearly visible, despite the fact that they had just worked the same call together, Sullivan was treating him like a suspect. "Brad, it's me," James said slowly, raising his hands but keeping his voice calm. "Detective James Thompson. Badge number 1247. We just worked this call together." But Sullivan wasn't listening. His gun was out now, pointed directly at James. "Get on the ground, now!" James knew he had to be very careful. One wrong move, one sudden gesture, and this situation could turn deadly. He'd been trained for moments like this, but he'd never imagined he'd be on the receiving end of another officer's weapon. "Brad, look at my uniform," James said, speaking slowly and clearly. "Look at my badge. I'm a police officer. I'm Detective Thompson." "Shut up and get down," Sullivan screamed. The next few seconds felt like hours. James could see Sullivan's finger on the trigger. He could see the fear and confusion in the younger officer's eyes, but more than that, he could see something else. Something that made his blood run cold. Sullivan knew exactly who he was. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity and poor lighting. This wasn't confusion or panic. Sullivan was looking directly at Detective James Thompson, a decorated 15-year veteran of the police force, and he was treating him like a criminal for one reason only. James was black, and Sullivan couldn't see past that. "I'm a police officer," James said one more time, his voice steady despite the fear growing in his chest. "I'm Detective Thompson. Look at my badge." The shots came without warning. 2 quick pops that echoed through the quiet neighborhood like firecrackers. James felt the first bullet hit his chest, spinning him around. The second caught him in the shoulder as he fell. The world tilted sideways, and suddenly he was looking up at the foggy sky, raindrops starting to fall again on his face. He could hear Sullivan on his radio, calling for an ambulance and backup. "Officer down," Sullivan was saying. "Shots fired. I need medical assistance immediately." But James knew the truth. As he lay on the wet pavement, feeling his blood mixing with the rainwater, he knew that this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was something much worse, and it was something that had been building for a long time. In the distance, he could hear sirens getting closer. Jennifer Walsh had come back outside and was screaming. Lights were coming on in houses up and down the street. The quiet neighborhood was about to become the center of a storm that would shake the entire city. As the world started to fade around the edges, James thought about his family. Rachel would be getting a phone call soon that would change their lives forever. Lisa and David would have to grow up knowing that their father had been shot by another police officer, simply because of the color of his skin. The last thing James remembered before everything went black was the sound of Sullivan's voice on the radio, telling the dispatcher that he had been forced to shoot a suspect who had threatened him. Even as James lost consciousness, he could hear the lies beginning. The cover-up was starting before the ambulance had even arrived. But Sullivan had made one crucial mistake. He hadn't noticed the small security camera mounted on the corner of Jennifer Walsh's house. A camera that had recorded everything. A camera that would tell the real story of what happened on Maple Street that night. The truth was out there, captured in digital memory, waiting to be discovered. And when it was found, it would change everything. The phone call came at 1:47 in the morning. Rachel Thompson was deep in sleep when the harsh sound cut through her dreams. She fumbled for the phone on her nightstand, her heart already racing because nothing good ever happened when the phone rang this late. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Chief Patricia Hayes from the Pine Valley Police Department." Rachel sat up straight in bed, suddenly wide awake. "What's wrong? Is James okay?" There was a pause that lasted too long. In that silence, Rachel felt her entire world begin to shift. "Mrs. Thompson, your husband has been involved in a shooting incident. He's been taken to Central General Hospital. You need to come right away." The next hour passed in a blur. Rachel called her sister to come stay with the kids, threw on clothes, and drove through empty streets to the hospital. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the steering wheel. The hospital staff directed her to the intensive care unit, where she found Chief Hayes waiting with two other officers she didn't recognize. "How bad is it?" Rachel asked before anyone could say hello. Chief Hayes was a woman in her 50s who had been with the department for over 20 years. She had worked her way up through the ranks and was known for being tough but fair. Tonight she looked tired and stressed. "He's stable," the chief said. "The doctors are doing everything they can. The bullets hit his chest and shoulder, but they missed any vital organs. He's going to need surgery, but the doctors are optimistic." Rachel felt some of the tension leave her body, but she had more questions. What happened? Who shot him? This time, the pause was even longer. Chief Hayes exchanged glances with the other officers before speaking. James was responding to a domestic disturbance call. Officer Sullivan arrived as backup. There was some kind of confusion in the darkness, and Officer Sullivan mistook James for a suspect. It appears to have been a tragic case of mistaken identity. Rachel stared at the chief, trying to process what she was hearing. Mistaken identity? James was in uniform, wasn't he? He had his badge? "The incident is under investigation," one of the other officers said quickly. "We can't discuss details right now." Rachel wanted to ask more questions, but at that moment, a doctor appeared to update her on James's condition. For the next several hours, her attention was focused entirely on her husband. The surgery took 4 hours, and when it was over, the doctor told her that James would live, but there had been damage to his spinal cord. It was too early to know how much function he might regain. While Rachel sat by her husband's bedside, Chief Hayes was dealing with a crisis that was growing by the hour. The shooting of one police officer by another was the kind of incident that could destroy careers and tear apart a department. She had been a cop long enough to know that the next few days would determine whether the Pine Valley Police Department could survive this scandal. At 6 a.m., Hayes called an emergency meeting with her command staff. The conference room at police headquarters felt tense as 8 senior officers gathered around the long table. Hayes looked around the room at faces she had worked with for years, knowing that some of them might not be there much longer. "Let's start with what we know," Hayes said. "Officer Sullivan responded to a domestic disturbance call as backup for Detective Thompson. According to Sullivan's statement, he arrived on scene and saw what he believed was a suspect acting suspiciously near a police vehicle. He claims he ordered the person to stop and identify himself, but the individual made threatening movements. Sullivan fired 2 shots in what he describes as self-defense. Captain Robert Martinez, the head of the detective division and James Thompson's immediate supervisor, spoke up. "What about Thompson's account?" "Thompson hasn't regained consciousness yet," Hayes replied. "The doctors say it could be several hours before we can speak with him." Lieutenant Karen Foster, who supervised the patrol division that included Sullivan, looked uncomfortable. "Chief, I have to tell you, there have been some concerns about Sullivan's behavior recently. Nothing that rose to the level of formal complaints, but other officers have mentioned incidents." Hayes nodded grimly. "I'm aware of Sullivan's history. That's why this situation is so problematic. We need to control the narrative until we have all the facts." What Chief Hayes didn't know was that some of those facts were already out there, waiting to be discovered. Jennifer Walsh, the woman whose domestic dispute had led to the police call, had installed a security system 6 months earlier after a break-in in her neighborhood. The small camera mounted near her front door had a clear view of the street where the shooting had occurred. Jennifer had watched the entire incident unfold from her window. She had seen Officer Sullivan arrive and speak briefly with Detective Thompson. She had watched as Sullivan suddenly drew his weapon and began shouting orders. Most importantly, she had seen that Thompson clearly identified himself as a police officer multiple times before Sullivan opened fire. But Jennifer was scared. She had heard Sullivan's version of events on the news, and she knew that speaking up would mean contradicting a police officer's official statement. She was a single mother with a good job at an accounting firm, and she couldn't afford to get involved in a controversy that might affect her career or put her family at risk. Meanwhile, at police headquarters, the damage control efforts were in full swing. The police union representative, Tony Breslin, had arrived to meet with Sullivan and make sure his rights were protected. Breslin was known for his aggressive defense of officers who found themselves in trouble, and he had already begun crafting a strategy. "This is clearly a case of mistaken identity and poor lighting conditions," Breslin told the small group gathered in the chief's office. Officer Sullivan responded to a dangerous situation and made a split-second decision to protect himself and the public. Any officer in the same situation would have done the same thing. Sullivan himself sat quietly in the corner, still wearing his uniform from the night before. He looked shaken, but not in the way someone would look if they had accidentally shot a fellow officer. Instead, he seemed more concerned about protecting himself than expressing regret about what had happened to Thompson. "I want to see the scene." "Again?" Sullivan said suddenly. "I want to walk through exactly what happened so we can get the facts straight." Chief Hayes shook her head. "The scene is still being processed by the crime scene unit. We can't have you there right now." What Hayes didn't mention was that the crime scene investigators had already found some troubling evidence. Thompson's badge had been clearly visible on his uniform. His police radio was still clipped to his belt, and it had been turned on during the entire incident. Most significantly, the investigators had found Thompson's service weapon still in its holster, with the safety strap securely fastened. By 8 a.m., word of the shooting had leaked to the local media. The first news reports were brief and followed the police department's official line. A Pine Valley police officer was shot and wounded early this morning in what appears to be a case of mistaken identity. The injured officer is in stable condition at Central General Hospital. The shooting officer has been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. But in the digital age, information travels fast, and it wasn't long before reporters began asking more detailed questions. Who was the injured officer? What exactly had led to the confusion? Why was there no body camera footage available? The last question was particularly problematic for Chief Hayes. The Pine Valley Police Department had been slow to adopt body cameras, partly due to budget constraints and partly due to resistance from officers who didn't want their every action recorded. Thompson, as a detective, didn't routinely wear a body camera. Sullivan, as a patrol officer, should have been wearing one, but he claimed it had malfunctioned at the beginning of his shift. By noon, the story was getting attention beyond the local media. Social media posts were spreading, and activist groups were beginning to ask questions about whether race had played a role in the shooting. The fact that a black detective had been shot by a white patrol officer was not lost on anyone, even though the police department hadn't officially released those details. In the hospital, Rachel Thompson was trying to shield her children from the growing media attention while staying focused on her husband's recovery. James had briefly regained consciousness around 10 a.m., but he was heavily sedated and unable to speak clearly. The doctors said it would be at least another day before he was alert enough to give a detailed account of what had happened. Lisa and David Thompson arrived at the hospital with their aunt around lunchtime. They had seen some of the news coverage and they were confused and angry about the conflicting reports they were hearing. "Mom, the news said Dad was shot because another police officer thought he was a criminal," Lisa said. "How is that possible? Dad's been a cop for 15 years, everyone knows him." Rachel didn't have good answers for her daughter. She was beginning to suspect that there was more to the story than what the police department was telling her, but she couldn't prove anything yet. Meanwhile, across town, Jennifer Walsh was wrestling with her conscience. She had called in sick to work and spent the morning watching news coverage of the shooting. Every time she heard Detective Captain Robert Martinez couldn't sleep. It was 3 a.m. and he was sitting in his kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. In his 22 years with the Pine Valley Police Department, he had never faced anything like this. The security footage from Jennifer Walsh's house was playing over and over in his mind, and each time he remembered what he had seen, he felt sick. Martinez had worked with James Thompson for 8 years. They had been partners for 3 of those. years before Martinez was promoted to captain. He knew James as well as he knew anyone on the force. James was careful, professional, and had never been involved in any kind of controversial incident. He was the kind of officer that departments built their reputations on. Officer Brad Sullivan was a different story entirely. Martinez had read Sullivan's personnel file that afternoon, and what he found there was troubling. There had been 4 citizen complaints in 3 years, all involving allegations of excessive force or inappropriate behavior. Each time, the complaints had been investigated and dismissed due to lack of evidence or credibility issues with the complainants. But Martinez knew that pattern. He had seen it before with officers who gradually became problems. The complaints would start small, be dismissed as misunderstandings, and then escalate over time until something serious happened. The department had failed to recognize the warning signs with Sullivan, and now James Thompson was lying in a hospital bed because of that failure. At 6 a.m., Martinez received a call from Chief Hayes. "I need you in my office immediately," she said. "We have a situation." When Martinez arrived at headquarters, he found Hayes meeting with the mayor, the city attorney, and a representative from the FBI. The federal involvement meant that this case had already escalated beyond anything the local department could handle on its own. "Detective Captain Martinez," said Agent Rebecca Chen from the FBI Civil Rights Division, "I understand you've been reviewing the evidence in the Thompson shooting." Martinez nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I've seen the security footage and reviewed both officers' files." "What's your assessment?" Martinez looked around the room, knowing that his next words would have consequences for everyone present. "Based on the evidence, I believe Officer Sullivan deliberately shot Detective Thompson, despite clearly knowing he was a fellow police officer. This was not a case of mistaken identity." The silence that followed was heavy. Mayor William Davies, who had been hoping for a way to minimize the political damage from the incident, realized that his problems had just gotten much worse. "Are you saying one of our officers attempted to murder another officer?" the mayor asked. "I'm saying the evidence suggests that Officer Sullivan's actions were intentional and cannot be explained by confusion or poor lighting." Martinez replied carefully. Agent Chen made notes on her legal pad. "Captain Martinez, I'll need you to provide a full statement later today. We'll also need copies of all personnel files, training records, and any previous complaints or incidents involving Officer Sullivan." While this meeting was taking place, Sullivan was at home, unaware that the security footage had been discovered. He had spent the previous day with his union representative, going over his story and preparing for the inevitable investigation. Tony Breslin had assured him that the department would protect him as long as he stuck to his account of the events. Sullivan lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Pine Valley. He had few friends on the force and spent most of his free time alone. His neighbors knew him as quiet and unfriendly, the kind of person who kept to himself and didn't make an effort to connect with others. What his neighbors didn't know was that Sullivan's isolation had slowly turned into resentment over the years. He felt that he had been passed over for promotions and assignments because the department favored minority officers. He believed that affirmative action policies were holding back qualified white officers like himself. These feelings had gradually hardened into something darker and more dangerous. On his personal social media accounts, which he thought were private, Sullivan had shared posts and memes that revealed his true beliefs. There were complaints about reverse racism and comments about certain neighborhoods being war zones. Most troubling were his interactions with groups that promoted white supremacist ideology, though he was careful never to post anything directly that could get him in trouble at work. At the hospital, James Thompson was finally alert enough to speak with investigators. Detective Lieutenant Karen Foster sat beside his bed while a stenographer recorded his statement. James's voice was weak, but his memory of the incident was crystal clear. "I had just finished talking with Mrs. Walsh about her domestic situation," James began slowly. "Everything was routine. Officer Sullivan arrived as I was completing my report. We spoke briefly about the call, and then I walked toward my patrol car." Foster nodded encouragingly. "What happened next?" "Sullivan called my name. When I turned around, he had his hand on his weapon. He told me to put my hands up. I was confused because we had just been talking normally. Did you identify yourself as a police officer? Multiple times, James said firmly. I told him I was Detective Thompson. I showed him my badge. I even gave him my badge number, but he kept pointing his gun at me and ordering me to get on the ground. Foster felt a chill as James continued. The worst part was his eyes. He wasn't confused or scared. He knew exactly who I was. He was looking at me like I was something dangerous, something that needed to be eliminated. What happened immediately before he fired? James was quiet for a moment, and Foster could see tears forming in his eyes. I said one more time that I was a police officer. I said, Brad, it's me, Detective Thompson, and then he shot me. The formal statement took 2 hours to complete. When it was finished, Foster knew that they had a case that would shock the entire law enforcement community. This wasn't just a shooting. It was a hate crime committed by one police officer against another. Meanwhile, Jennifer Walsh was discovering that doing the right thing came with a price. Word had somehow leaked that she was the witness who had provided video evidence, and she was receiving threatening phone calls. Someone had thrown a rock through her front window during the night, and her boss at the accounting firm had suggested that she might want to take some time off until things cooled down. Jennifer was scared, but she was also angry. She had watched a good man get shot for no reason other than the color of his skin, and now people were trying to intimidate her into staying quiet. She decided to fight back by going public with her story. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, Jennifer held a press conference on the front steps of City Hall. With her lawyer standing beside her, she told the assembled reporters exactly what she had witnessed. I saw Officer Sullivan recognize Detective Thompson as a fellow police officer, she said clearly. I heard Detective Thompson identify himself multiple times. What happened on my street was not a mistake or confusion. It was a deliberate act of violence against a good man who was just doing his job. The press conference was broadcast live on local television and quickly picked up by national news outlets. Within hours, the story was trending on social media, and Pine Valley was thrust into the national spotlight. The police union's response was swift and predictable. Tony Breslin held his own press conference that evening, claiming that Jennifer Walsh was confused about what she had seen and that Officer Sullivan was the victim of a rush to judgment. Officer Sullivan responded to a dangerous situation and made a split-second decision to protect himself, Breslin declared. Any attempt to second-guess his actions from the comfort of hindsight is unfair and dangerous to all law enforcement officers. But Breslin's defense was already falling apart. The FBI investigation had uncovered Sullivan's social media activity, and federal agents were building a case that this was a civil rights violation motivated by racial hatred. Dr. Angela Martinez, a forensic psychologist who specialized in law enforcement issues, was brought in to evaluate Sullivan's mental state and fitness for duty. Her review of his personnel file and psychological evaluation revealed troubling patterns. Officer Sullivan exhibits signs of what we call warrior mentality, Dr. Martinez explained to the investigation team. He sees policing as a battle between us and them, with civilian populations viewed as potential enemies rather than people to protect and serve. More damaging was Dr. Martinez's analysis of Sullivan's racial attitudes. The evidence suggests deeply ingrained prejudices that have been reinforced over time. When combined with the authority and weapons that come with being a police officer, these attitudes create a dangerous situation. As the investigation expanded, more evidence emerged about Sullivan's past behavior. 3 officers came forward with stories about inappropriate comments Sullivan had made about minority suspects and fellow officers. A review of his arrest records showed a pattern of using excessive force against Black and Hispanic suspects. Most damning was the discovery that Sullivan had been drinking before his shift on the night of the shooting. A receipt from a bar near the police station showed that he had consumed at least 3 drinks in the hour before reporting for duty. Alcohol tests hadn't been conducted immediately after the shooting, so this evidence couldn't prove intoxication. District Attorney Michael Thompson walked into his office on Monday morning, knowing that the most important decision of his career was waiting for him on his desk. The FBI's investigation file on Officer Brad Sullivan was 3 inches thick, and every page made the case for criminal prosecution stronger. Thompson had been the district attorney for Pine Valley County for 12 years. He had prosecuted hundreds of cases, including several involving police officers accused of misconduct, but he had never seen evidence this clear or a case this politically explosive. The decision he made in the next few days would affect not just Sullivan and Detective James Thompson, but the entire relationship between law enforcement and the community. The pressure was enormous. The police union had been calling his office daily, demanding that he reject the case and allow the department to handle the matter internally. Union representatives argued that prosecuting Sullivan would make it impossible for officers to do their jobs, knowing that split-second decisions could result in criminal charges. On the other side, civil rights organizations, community leaders, and James Thompson's family were demanding that Sullivan face the full weight of the law. They argued that anything less than prosecution would send a message that police officers were above the law and could target minority colleagues without consequences. Thompson spread the evidence across his conference table and began reviewing it one more time. The security footage from Jennifer Walsh's house was devastating. It showed Sullivan clearly recognizing James Thompson as a fellow officer, hearing Thompson identify himself multiple times, and then deliberately choosing to shoot anyway. The forensic evidence was equally damning. James Thompson's service weapon had remained in its holster throughout the incident, with the safety strap still fastened. There were no signs that Thompson had made any threatening movements. The ballistics report showed that Sullivan had fired from a distance where he could clearly see Thompson's uniform and badge. Most troubling was the evidence about Sullivan's state of mind. The FBI had uncovered social media posts going back several years that revealed deeply racist attitudes. There were private messages to friends complaining about diversity hires in the police department and expressing the belief that minority officers weren't qualified for their positions. Thompson's phone rang, interrupting his review. It was FBI agent Rebecca Chen calling with an update on the federal investigation. "We've found more evidence," Chen said without preamble. Sullivan had been researching James Thompson online for several weeks before the shooting. He looked up Thompson's home address, his family information, and his work schedule. Thompson felt his stomach drop. "Are you saying this was premeditated?" "The evidence suggests Sullivan had been planning some kind of confrontation with Thompson," Chen replied. "We found browser history showing he had looked up Thompson's patrol routes and shift schedules. This wasn't a random encounter." This new information changed everything. What Thompson had initially thought might be a case of assault or attempted murder was beginning to look like a carefully planned attack motivated by racial hatred. That afternoon, Thompson met with his senior prosecutors to discuss the charges. Assistant District Attorney Lisa Rodriguez, who headed the office's civil rights unit, argued for the most serious charges possible. "We have attempted murder, civil rights violations, and evidence of premeditation," Rodriguez said. "This is one of the clearest cases of racially motivated violence I've ever seen." Chief Deputy District Attorney Robert Kane was more cautious. "We need to be careful about overcharging," he warned. "The defense will argue that Sullivan was responding to what he perceived as a threat. If we aim too high and lose, Sullivan walks away completely." Thompson listened to both arguments, but he knew that the evidence was strong enough to support serious charges. More importantly, he knew that this case was about more than just one shooting. It was about whether the justice system could hold police officers accountable when they violated their oath and betrayed the public trust. On Wednesday morning, Thompson called a press conference to announce his decision. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters, community members, and law enforcement officers. Television trucks lined the street, and the announcement was being broadcast live across the country. After a thorough review of the evidence, Thompson began, "My office is filing charges against former Officer Brad Sullivan for attempted murder in the first degree, violation of civil rights under color of law, and assault with a deadly weapon." The crowd erupted in cheers and boos depending on where people stood on the issue. Thompson continued over the noise. "The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Sullivan deliberately shot Detective James Thompson despite knowing he was a fellow police officer. This was not a case of mistaken identity or poor judgment. This was a premeditated act of violence motivated by racial hatred." Within hours, Sullivan was arrested at his apartment. The booking photos showed a man who looked angry rather than remorseful, and his first words to reporters were that he was the victim of a political prosecution. Sullivan's defense team was led by attorney David Kellerman, a former prosecutor, who specialized in defending police officers accused of excessive force. Kellerman immediately began crafting a defense strategy that would portray Sullivan as a dedicated officer who had made an honest mistake in a dangerous situation. Officer Sullivan responded to a call in a high-crime area late at night. Kellerman said at a press conference following Sullivan's arraignment. He saw what appeared to be a suspicious individual near a police vehicle and reacted appropriately to protect himself and the public. Any suggestion that this was motivated by racism is completely unfounded. But Kellerman's job was made much more difficult by the evidence that continued to emerge. The FBI's forensic examination of Sullivan's computer revealed that he had been active on white supremacist websites and had made donations to organizations that promoted racial hatred. Even more damaging was the discovery of text messages between Sullivan and a friend from his police academy class. In one exchange from just 2 weeks before the shooting, Sullivan had written, "These diversity hires are going to get real cops killed. Someone needs to do something about it." The trial was scheduled to begin 6 months after the shooting. In the meantime, the case became a national symbol of the broader struggle for police accountability and racial justice. Protesters regularly gathered outside the courthouse, and the story was covered extensively by national media. James Thompson's recovery became part of the story as well. Despite being paralyzed from the waist down, he had returned to work in a civilian capacity, helping to train officers on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. His courage and determination in the face of tragedy inspired people across the country. "I don't want what happened to me to be in vain," Thompson said in an interview with a national news magazine. "If my experience can help prevent other officers from being corrupted by hatred and prevent other families from going through what mine has endured, then some good will come from this tragedy." Rachel Thompson had become an advocate for police reform, speaking at conferences and working with legislators to develop new policies for preventing and addressing misconduct. Her children, Lisa and David, had both decided they wanted to become lawyers and fight for justice in their father's honor. As the trial date approached, both sides prepared their cases. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence of Sullivan's guilt, but they knew that getting a conviction against a police officer would be challenging. Juries were often reluctant to second-guess the split-second decisions that officers had to make in dangerous situations. The defense strategy became clear during pretrial hearings. Kellerman would argue that Sullivan had genuinely feared for his life and that the shooting was justified under the circumstances. He would claim that the racist social media posts were taken out of context and didn't reflect Sullivan's true beliefs or motivations. The first major breakthrough for the prosecution came when Officer Mike Rodriguez, Sullivan's former partner, agreed to testify against him. Rodriguez had initially been reluctant to speak out against a fellow officer, but the evidence had convinced him that staying silent would be wrong. Brad made racist comments regularly, Rodriguez told prosecutors during a pretrial interview. He would refer to minority suspects using slurs and would often say that black officers weren't qualified for their positions. He specifically mentioned Detective Thompson several times, saying that Thompson had only gotten promoted because of affirmative action. Rodriguez's testimony would be crucial because it showed that Sullivan's attack on Thompson wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of racist behavior that had been building for years. Another key witness was Dr. Angela Martinez, the forensic psychologist who had evaluated Sullivan. Her testimony would help explain how Sullivan's racist beliefs had developed into a willingness to commit violence against a fellow officer. "Mr. Sullivan exhibits classic signs of what we call othering," Dr. Martinez explained to the prosecution team. He had convinced himself that Detective Thompson and other minority officers were not legitimate members of the police force, which made it easier for him to justify violence against them. The sentencing hearing took place on a sunny morning in April, exactly 1 year after Brad Sullivan had shot Detective James Thompson on Maple Street. Judge Patricia Williams had spent weeks reviewing the case files, victim impact statements, and sentencing recommendations before making her decision. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and law enforcement officers from across the region. This wasn't just about Sullivan anymore. It had become a symbol of whether the justice system could truly hold police officers accountable for their crimes. Sullivan sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, having been held without bail since his conviction. His family sat in the front row behind him, looking tired and defeated. His mother had aged years in the months since the trial, and his father stared straight ahead with hollow eyes. On the other side of the courtroom, James Thompson sat in his wheelchair next to his wife Rachel and their children. He had chosen to attend the sentencing because he wanted to look Sullivan in the eye one more time and speak directly about the impact of his crimes. Judge Williams called the court to order and began by acknowledging the significance of the case. In my 20 years on the bench, I have never presided over a case that has had such a profound impact on our community and our understanding of justice, she said. The defendant's actions didn't just harm Detective Thompson and his family. They damaged the trust between law enforcement and the community, and they betrayed the oath that every police officer takes to protect and serve all people equally. The victim impact statements began with James Thompson himself. Rolling his wheelchair to the podium, he looked directly at Sullivan before beginning to speak. "Brad, I want you to understand what you took from me that night," James said, his voice clear and strong. "You didn't just take away my ability to walk. You took away my sense of safety in my own profession. You took away my children's belief that police officers are the good guys. You took away my wife's peace of mind every time another officer comes to our door." James paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But you didn't take away my determination to make sure this never happens to another family. You didn't take away my commitment to justice, and you didn't take away my belief that most police officers are good people who deserve better than to be represented by someone like you." Rachel Thompson spoke next, describing the year of surgeries, physical therapy, and emotional trauma that her family had endured. She talked about her children's struggles with depression and anxiety, about the financial burden of medical bills, and about the daily challenges of caring for a paralyzed spouse. "My husband was shot by someone who was supposed to be his brother in arms," she said, tears streaming down her face. "The person who was supposed to watch his back instead put a bullet in it. That betrayal is something our family will carry for the rest of our lives." Lisa Thompson, now 17 and planning to study law in college, spoke about how the shooting had changed her perspective on justice and equality. "I used to think that racism was something from the past, something my parents' generation had solved," she said. "What happened to my father taught me that hatred is still alive, and that it can wear a badge and carry a gun. But it also taught me that good people can fight back and win." David Thompson, now 15 and captain of his high school basketball team, spoke about his father's courage and determination. "My dad could have been bitter and angry after what happened to him," David said. "Instead, he chose to fight for change. He chose to make sure that other families wouldn't have to go through what we went through. That's the kind of man I want to be when I grow up." The prosecution then presented its sentencing recommendation. Assistant District Attorney Lisa Rodriguez argued for the maximum penalty allowed under law. "The defendant's crimes strike at the very heart of our justice system," Rodriguez said. "When a police officer uses his badge and weapon to commit racially motivated violence against a fellow officer, he doesn't just harm his victim, he undermines the legitimacy of law enforcement itself." Rodriguez detailed Sullivan's lack of remorse throughout the trial and his continued insistence that he had done nothing wrong. She pointed to his social media activity from prison where he had continued to express racist views and portray himself as a victim. "The defendant has shown no understanding of the severity of his crimes and no indication that he would behave differently if given another chance," she said. "The only appropriate sentence is one that ensures he can never again abuse the power and authority of a police badge." Defense attorney David Kellerman made a final plea for leniency, arguing that Sullivan had been a dedicated officer who had made a terrible mistake under pressure. "My client's actions were inexcusable, but they were the result of poor training and a moment of panic, not calculated hatred," Kellerman said. "He has already lost his career, his reputation, and his freedom. Destroying the rest of his life, serves no purpose other than revenge. Kellerman presented letters from Sullivan's family and a few former colleagues who described him as a caring person who had somehow lost his way. But these character references were overshadowed by the mountain of evidence showing Sullivan's racist beliefs and premeditated actions. Judge Williams then asked Sullivan if he had anything to say before sentencing. Sullivan stood slowly, looking around the courtroom before speaking. "I want to say that I never intended for any of this to happen," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was trying to do my job and protect people. I'm sorry that Detective Thompson was hurt, and I'm sorry for what his family has gone through." But even this apology felt hollow and self-serving. Sullivan couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that his actions were motivated by racism, or that he had deliberately targeted Thompson. His words only reinforced the impression that he still didn't understand the true nature of his crimes. Judge Williams took a brief recess before announcing her decision. When court reconvened, the room was silent as she began to speak. "Mr. Sullivan, you have been convicted of attempted murder, civil rights violations, and assault with a deadly weapon. These are serious crimes that demand serious consequences. But your crimes are made even more egregious by the fact that you committed them while wearing a police badge." The judge continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Police officers are given extraordinary authority and power in our society. They carry weapons, they can detain and arrest citizens, and they are entrusted with protecting the most vulnerable members of our community. When an officer abuses that power, especially to commit racially motivated violence, they betray not just their victim but the entire concept of justice under law." Judge Williams sentenced Sullivan to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was longer than what many had expected, but it reflected the severity of his crimes and the need to send a clear message about police accountability. Sullivan showed no emotion as the sentence was announced. He was led away in handcuffs while his family wept in the gallery. For them, the man they thought they knew had been revealed as someone completely different, and they were left to grapple with the reality of who he really was. Outside the courthouse, community leaders and civil rights activists celebrated the verdict as a victory for justice. But they also acknowledged that this was just one case, and that much more work needed to be done to address systemic problems in law enforcement. The conviction and sentencing of Brad Sullivan had immediate effects on the Pine Valley Police Department and law enforcement agencies across the country. Chief Patricia Hayes, who had courageously supported the prosecution despite pressure from the police union, announced a comprehensive reform program designed to prevent future incidents. The reforms included mandatory bias training for all officers, psychological evaluations every 2 years, and a new early warning system to identify officers who showed signs of problematic behavior. The department also implemented a zero-tolerance policy for racist speech or behavior, with immediate termination for any violations. Perhaps most importantly, the department established a civilian oversight board with the power to investigate complaints against officers and recommend disciplinary action. The board included community leaders, civil rights advocates, and representatives from minority communities who had long felt excluded from police accountability processes. James Thompson became the face of these reform efforts. Despite his physical limitations, he returned to work as a consultant and trainer, helping to develop new policies and procedures for police departments across the country. His foundation, established with donations from supporters around the EUBIN world, provided funding for bias training, community policing programs, and support for families affected by police violence. What happened to me was terrible, but if it leads to changes that prevent other families from going through this trauma, then some good will have come from it, James said in an interview on the first anniversary of the shooting. The Thompson Foundation's work expanded beyond Pine Valley to become a national model for police reform. James and Rachel traveled to dozens of cities, sharing their story and helping local communities develop their own accountability measures.